I'm Cassandra. I'm in the MFA program and volunteering for the festival. Thank you so much for supporting the Montana Book Festival. We have a panel and a reading today on environmental writing and how to write environmental narratives that are true yet hopeful in this somewhat difficult age in which to do that. Our speakers today are Julia B. Corbett, Paige Embry, and Ben Goldfarb. We're so happy to have them. I'll do an introduction before each author reads, and then we can have some question and answer at the end. And if you have a question for a particular reader after their reading, you can ask that too. First up is Julia B. Corbett. She is a professor in the Department of Communication and Environmental Humanities at the University of Utah. Her scholarship investigates human relationships with the natural world, and her books include Out of the Woods, Seeing Nature in the Everyday, that came out this year, 7 Summers, A Naturalist's Homestead in the Modern West, Communicating Nature, How We Create and Understand Environmental Messages, and Communicating Earth, Learning to Engage with Climate Change, and that's one that's in process. So let's welcome Julia.
Thank you. And if it's all right with you, I'm going to stand so I can see you, and so you can see me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of how the book came about, or more likely how it's kind of arranged and my thoughts about that. And then I'm going to read a little bit out of the title chapter. So what I wanted to do with this book was to kind of reimagine what we often consider to be two different natures. There's the wild stuff where we go on our weekends and play and recreate, and it usually doesn't have many people in it. And then there's the nature that's around us every day. So even when I ask my students, where's nature? They go, there. But no, it's like, we don't have any other choice. It all comes from nature, everything around us. So I wanted to look at how those two are connected and kind of the spillover between those two and the consequences of that. Another aim is to try and draw back the cultural curtain, because culture really very much influences how we see and value those two natures. So the chapters are each standalone. So there's a chapter about animals, there's one about insects, there's one about garbage, there's one about gardening, and several having to do specifically with language. And then finally, I'm trying to kind of examine how we treat and value these two natures very differently. And that is foundational. How we treat and value nature around us every day is foundational for what's happening to the wilder pieces. So this is from the title chapter, Out of the Woods. He's out of the woods, the emergency room nurse said, at least for now. We'll know more tomorrow after he's had more tests. But right now, your dad is alert and stable. He's able to respond to commands, but his speech is pretty garbled. The phone line hummed. We'll know more tomorrow, but he's out of the woods for now, she repeated. Okay, thanks, I said, and hung up. Hot winds whipped the maple tree in my front yard as the edge of a front crossed the Salt Lake Valley. What the nurse, who had just come on duty, did not know was that hours earlier my dad was found in the woods behind his house where he collapsed. On a 100-degree Iowa August day, he struggled desperately to get out of the woods, pulling himself along on saplings and roots inch by inch, dragging his paralyzed right side through a tangle of branches and barbed wire, pushing off on his good left foot. He lost his glasses and one shoe. He ripped his khakis, his dress shirt. He lay there for hours. The police and paramedics said perhaps 8 hours, maybe 18, unable to call out. When friends searched a second time, he managed to raise his left arm. In the years since that day, my ears alert to the phrase, out of the woods. The weatherman says we're not out of the woods from the latest Pacific storm. The economist says we're not out of the woods in the housing market. My mechanic pronounced after repairing one tire that I wasn't out of the woods because the other 3 were wearing thin. The cultural phrase conveys that woods are full of danger and difficulties, a place one must leave to be safe and secure. Yet for my father and for me, woods were a sanctuary of great solace and joy. The 1960 Rambler my parents built was surrounded by woods, woods more familiar to us kids than any playground. Yet there is something about woods and what they culturally represent that begets this enduring metaphor, which has been uttered through decades, perhaps centuries. Lifetimes of associating woods with dangerous places to escape must lead to some degree of consequence. But at the root, Out of the Woods speaks to the uncontrollable nature of nature and of being mortal, chiefly the terror of death. When I was a naturalist for Olympic National Park in my 20s, each week I presented a campfire boldly titled Wilderness. I drew campers in by lighting a big fire with a flint and steel. Then I clicked through sublime slides of rainforests and glaciers and explained that the word wilderness came from an Old English word, wildeor, meaning of or about wild beasts. In between shots of bright white mountain goats and marmots, I extolled the wooded wilderness. I was naive then about the ancient biases against wild woods that were deeply rooted in the psychology and history of our ancestors. When William Bradford stepped off the Mayflower, he called the woods hideous and desolate and began a tradition of repugnance-driven taming. In Wilderness in the American Mind, historian Roderick Nash notes that except for brief movements like Romanticism, most of European and Western history considered wild nature a moral and physical wasteland, a fearful place of sinister monsters and degenerate savages. Nash wrote, "Safety, happiness, and progress all seem dependent on rising out of a wilderness situation. It became essential to gain control over nature." Then I'm going to skip a few pieces here. So we learned that Dad had had a CVA, a very large stroke, and that my brother Jim and I needed to come immediately. Driving from the airport north to Ames, Bob and Jenna stitched together a story with large holes. Bob, a chemistry colleague and longtime family friend, was the one who spotted Dad's raised arm on Tuesday about 4 p.m., the second time they had gone to the house. The house was locked, the garage door open, the car inside. Dad was at work all day Monday, but when he did not show up on a Tuesday, a staff scientist called the house repeatedly and then called Bob. Dad either walked into the woods Monday after work or Tuesday before work. The briefcase he always carried and his keys were missing. As Bob sped through the sultry blackness, the stalks of corn at the edges of the highway, of the headlights, waved their long brown leaves. Hurry, hurry. After midnight, Jim and I broke into Dad's house in the headlights of Bob's car. A dry, seething cacophony of cicadas rose from the muggy blackness of the woods. We found a spare car key and drove to the hospital. As we walked from the parking garage in the buzz of streetlights, it was eerily familiar. 6 years before, my older brother Scott died just minutes before we arrived from the airport. And 18 years ago, my mom died 2 days before our planes would land. The double doors sucked open at our approach, blasting us with frigid air. I took Dad's hand and kissed his cheek. He looked at us, one to the other, searching for cells in some section of his brain that would tell him who we were. Then I skip over some things about control. The intense desire for a dominant human imprint over something largely not human has always baffled me. I enjoy being immersed in the larger terra incognita and subject to rules not of my making or understanding. Deep familiarity with patterns of daylight and dark, the language of creatures and trees creaking in the wind, the smell and feel of wood and soil transforms them from places of terror and danger to ones of solace and serenity. People comfortable with wilderness find it a sheltering place to contemplate the incomprehensible, like mortality. But I have been afraid in the woods. On a solo backpack with my dog in an unfamiliar wilderness, I got terribly lost. On a backpack with my ex and brother Jim in central Idaho, we ran out of food. Cross-country skiing near Togety Pass in western Wyoming, I got hypothermia. In Idaho, in a whitewater river, our canoe swamped and I was pinned against a log. There is something about the yin and yang of fear and exhilaration when you brush against mortality that is life-affirming and even invigorating. Yin makes the yang more palpable, more known, and vice versa. When I encounter dangers in the woods, the fear stretches the boundaries. If there's nothing to risk, if it's all controlled and civilized, is there anything to gain? In the musical Into the Woods, the characters refreshingly seek not to get out of the woods, but charge into them, where they encounter the magical and monstrous. The woods are the stage for tests and quests and where ordinary life is left behind. Come what may, follow the path and never stray. Don't be scared, be prepared, says the refrain. The woods can be a dangerous place, they sing, but also a place to be wild and abandon your inhibitions. The baker's wife tells her husband, "You're different in the woods, more daring and more thriving." Yet the two characters who do not make it out of the woods were those who morally strayed: the baker's wife, who flirted with another man, and the witch. On Thursday morning, Jim and I walked into the woods behind Dad's house. The south side of the house opened to the gravel road. The other three sides were ringed by woods. The hard pan earth was furrowed and deeply cracked. We brushed by limp leaves, thin and blotched with brown spots. My shirt lay damp on my back. It was heading towards 102 degrees. The thick heat hushed the birds. There was no woodsy solace here. Broken branches and several long scuff marks revealed where Dad struggled. We thought we knew every inch of these woods, but didn't remember the very slight rise that hid his body from the house and from searchers. Trimmed brush lay in several piles. Dad told me he had been pruning some basswoods to give the redbuds more sun. We traversed the woods several times, but could not find his glasses or car keys. The image of Dad's struggle in the woods haunted me. I imagined him heading into the woods to see something, a bird, a bloom, then collapsing, clawing at the baked earth, not knowing if his woods would swallow him up. He lay in the blazing sun, bloodied and bruised, dying of thirst, unable to yell, unsure of rescue or escape. Dad was exceedingly strong-willed, and this so uncontrollable. What was the nature of his terror here? Helplessness, incapacity, death, dying alone? It certainly was not of the woods themselves, only that no one knew he was in them, which was its own terror. Jim and I left the sultry woods and drove with the AC on full blast to the hospital. We passed a tractor trailer parked near the football stadium with giant black letters all along the side. Haunted forest, don't go alone. Opens October 5th. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Burning questions to ask right now. You can feel free. Well, I was so excited to hear you mention Togedy Pass, because that's where I'm from, and then you said you got hypothermia there, so I'm sorry for that. Up next we have Paige Embry. Paige is the author of Our Native Bees, North America's Endangered Pollinators and the Fight to Save Them. That's coming out, or came out this year from Timber Press. Her multi-year obsession with the lives of America's native bees began with a gardening epiphany. That honeybees, which came from Europe with the colonists, can't pollinate tomatoes, but certain native bees can. She has written for the Scientific American, the Food and Environmental Reporting Network, Horticulture, and others. She lives, gardens, and stocks bees in Seattle, Washington. Welcome, Paige.
So here it is, the book. And one of the things that I will say about it is that it is filled with fabulous photos, none of which are mine. But it was a surprise to me when I started learning about bees how different they all are from each other. So my background is in geology, not in entomology. And after I had kids, I went back to school to study horticulture and started a little garden design and garden coaching business. And I had really done no writing other than environmental reports for a consulting company. But I started doing just a little bit of writing. I started a blog, I wrote some newsletters for the business, but had no plans and no thoughts of writing a book. And then I was looking for something to write about and was searching the internet and found an organization in Seattle, which is where I live, that was doing a big citizen science project using sort of crowdsourced data gathering to try and answer a question. And the question was, are there enough native bees in the city of Seattle to supply the pollination needs for the people growing, fruits and vegetables? And they were interested in the native bees, so they needed some way to exclude the honeybees because honeybees aren't native. They came over with the early colonists, and I had known that. But they chose to study tomatoes because honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes. And this was like a moment in my life. And I mean, it was a moment where my life changed because I had not known that. And I had shelves full of gardening books. How had I missed the fact that honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes? And so I started asking around. And almost nobody knew that honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes. And I was filled with this zeal. People should know. I was going to write articles. I was going to teach gardening for pollinator classes. So I set out to learn more about some of these other bees that can pollinate tomatoes and some of which can't. And I fell in love. So I spent a lot of time reading about bees, but I still could barely tell the difference when I went out and looked between a honeybee and a bumblebee. So I thought, I need a class. I like taking classes. And I looked around and there weren't any in Seattle, and so I found one in California. So I called them up and I said, if I come learn about California's bees, is that going to help me in Seattle? And they said, oh yes. And so I went. It was a 4-day bee identification seminar down there, you know, and you sleep on a porch with a bunch of strangers and you hunt bees. And I'd never tried to catch a bee before this. I'd never learned to identify bees. And while I was there, I learned a lot about sort of how one goes about catching and identifying bees, but I also heard a story. And this story, hearing this story was another moment because it was this story that made me decide that I wanted to write a book. And it was the first story that I wrote for this book. And the title of the chapter is called Did Greenhouse Tomatoes Kill the Last Franklin's Bumblebee? An old man walks the hills of southern Oregon, puffing on the slopes, eyes always scanning. He wears a t-shirt with a bee on it, a brimmed hat, and a photographer's vest stuffed with his tools. Kill jars, collection jars, a camera, a voice recorder, a kid's bug vacuum. He carries a bee net in his hand, ready for another day of tiny game hunting. His prey is the Franklin's bumblebee, noted for having the smallest range of any bumblebee in North America and possibly the world. The old man is Robin Thorpe, the world's expert on Franklin's bumblebee. Robin hasn't seen a Franklin since 2006. Neither has anyone else. The bee is probably extinct, but Robin continues to hunt and to hope. On a warm August day in 2014, I join him. Robin told me to meet him at the Mount Ashland campground up above the ski area. I arrive early, as usual, for fear of being late. So I wander. The campground appears to be built for mountain goats. Battered picnic tables stick improbably to the precipitous sides of the mountain. The views from each site are spectacular, but I'd fear that a jaunt to the bathroom in the night would result in a quick trip to the valley below. I wade through dried grasses and dying flowers seeking bees. I see what might be a wasp, and that's it. I'm not feeling hopeful for our chances this day. Soon enough, Robin arrives and we set off, carting our gear. Bee hunting is a pleasant but rather random affair for something scientific. It consists mostly of moseying, interspersed with brief periods of flailing with a net for beginners, or elegant sweeps by old pros. Robin, a seasoned and wily bee hunter, has a graceful and economical bee catching technique. The sun is warm, the wind light. It's a good day for bees, assuming the hot, dry summer has not put an early end to the bee season this year. We walk down the gravel road, shoes crunching, inspecting clumps of flowers for likely prey. Before long, the first catch of the day is in the net, buzzing angrily. To me, the bee is nothing but a black smudge obscured by netting. To Robin, it is a male Van Dyke's bumblebee. He reaches into the net and grabs the bee, pulling it out for inspection. Male bees have no stingers and so are safe to handle. I've tried to tell male bees from female bees before. It required a microscope and a dead bee. It's the first of many bees we catch and Robin identifies as we meander around the mountain. Robin is a professor emeritus of entomology at the University of California, Davis, and has been studying bees for close to 60 years. Once I asked him how many bees he thought he'd identified over the years, and oh, did he laugh. Thousands and thousands and thousands. We are joined this day, as he often is, by other bee acolytes, hoping to glean some of Robin's knowledge, which he hands out readily. We all wander from flower to flower, a bit like the bees ourselves. Periodically, I hear the whiff of a net swinging or the motor hum of Robin's bug vacuum. Tiny game hunting in action. Robin, ever the professor, quizzes us about the bees we find, but as the day progresses, conversations become more terse. I caught somebody big, I say. Robin walks over and contemplates the bee briefly. That's Queen of Flavifrons. He says, "Where'd you find that?" You can see a couple of yellow bands and the black on the tip. We release her, and Robin records the find on his voice recorder. We wander some more. We head down to the Pacific Crest Trail and amble along it for a while. Somewhere along this stretch is where Robin saw the last known Franklin's bumblebee 8 years earlier. I forgot to ask where. My brain was mush after hours of trying to recall bee markings. I'd wanted to see the exact spot, but maybe it doesn't matter. What does matter is that the Franklin's bumblebee seems to be gone, likely for good. And so it's this story about greenhouse tomatoes and an imported disease and big business and bigger government. And I listened to this story and I thought, wow, somebody should be telling this story. And so after I found that, I went out and looked for other bee stories. And so that's what the book is. It's me going out to learn more about bees, in part the role they play in agriculture, the part they play in our lives. And I found that one of the things that I loved about researching bees and bee conservation is that it's a place where I, as an individual, can make a difference. If I plant the flowers that bees like, they'll show up almost immediately a lot of times. And if I provide good nest areas, because most bees don't live in hives like honeybees do, most of them actually live in the ground. If I provide areas for them, a lot of them will stay. And so it is very gratifying it's like, I did something and it worked. And so one of the things we had said when we were sort of doing this panel was, it's like, what's it like to be writing about environmental issues now? And one of the things, again, that I loved about writing about bees is it's not all good news, but there is some good news and there is some hope about it. And so I write about that in the book as well.
So did greenhouse tomatoes actually kill the last Franklin's bumblebee? You gotta read the book.
Well, you do have to read the book. So it's they aren't 100% sure. That's Robin's theory, and they think it's because of a disease. It's a very convoluted story. We can get into it later if you want to. And so it's still up in the air, but nobody's come up with any other reason for why the Franklin's bumblebee has disappeared either.
As you can see, we have the books that we're discussing today for sale, so be sure to grab one that you're interested in, and I'm sure the authors would be happy to sign them. Last but not least, we have Ben Goldfarb. He's an award-winning environmental journalist and the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. I love that title. That was another book that came out this year from Chelsea Green Publishing, which the Washington Post called a masterpiece of a treatise on the natural world. His work has been featured in Science, Mother Jones, The Guardian, High Country News, and Orion Magazine, among others. And he holds a Master of Environmental Management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So thanks for joining us, Ben.
Thanks. So real quick, who here has generally positive beaver associations? Any negative beaver associations?
There's some.
Yeah, they can be a pain in the butt for sure. Anybody who hasn't thought at all about beavers? Total beaver agnostics.
Okay.
Cool. So the story of this book is a few years ago. I was living in Seattle, working for the magazine High Country News. Any HCN subscribers out there? Yeah, awesome. It's like half the room. That's so fantastic. And I did an article about the Methow Beaver Project in Central Washington. And what the Methow Beaver Project does is that they basically live trap nuisance beavers, so beavers that are flooding people's property or clogging up road culverts or cutting down their cottonwoods or what have you. And they take those beavers and they relocate them to public land high in the kind of the headwaters of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest in Central Washington, where beavers can create some habitat, build their dams, create some ponds and wetlands, and really do some good. So I spent a week with this sort of beaver crew relocating beavers, and I was so struck as I visited some of the sites where they had previously relocated beavers by how transformed those sites were. The ways in which the landscapes that beavers create look nothing like beaverless landscapes, so the landscapes that I, as a fly fisherman and hiker and backpacker, was sort of conditioned to expect. So that's what this book is about, really. It's sort of ostensibly about beavers, but it's really about what North American landscapes look like today, what they looked like before European arrival, and how the destruction of this really influential animal has fundamentally changed our continent's ecosystem. So I'm going to start in the introduction here, where I talk about that a little bit. Close your eyes. Picture, if you will, a healthy stream. What comes to mind? Perhaps you've conjured a crystalline, fast-moving creek, bounding merrily over rocks, its course narrow and shallow enough that you could leap or wade across the channel. If, like me, you are a fly fisherman, you might add a cheerful, knee-deep angler, casting for trout in a limpid riffle. It's a lovely picture, fit for an Orvis catalog. It's also wrong. Let's try again. This time, I want you to perform a more difficult imaginative feat. Instead of envisioning a present-day stream, I want you to reach into the past, before the mountain men, before the pilgrims, before Hudson and Champlain and the other horsemen of the fur-apocalypse, all the way back to the 1500s. I want you to imagine the streams that existed before global capitalism purged a continent of its dam-building, water-storing, wetland-creating engineers. I want you to imagine a landscape with its full complement of beavers. What do you see this time? No longer is our stream a pellucid, narrow, racing trickle. Instead, it's a sluggish, murky swamp, backed up several acres by a messy concatenation of woody dams. Gnawed stumps ring the marsh like punji sticks. Dead and dying trees stand aslant in a chest-deep pond. When you step into the water, you feel not rocks underfoot, but sludge. The musty stink of decomposition wafts into your nostrils. If there's a fisherman here, he's thrashing angrily in the willows, his fly caught in a tree. Although this beavery tableau isn't going to appear in any field and stream spreads, it's in many cases a more historically accurate picture, and in crucial ways, a much healthier one. In the Intermountain West, wetlands, though they make up just 2% of total land area, support 80% of biodiversity. You may not hear the tinkle of running water in our swamp, but listen closely for the songs of warblers and flycatchers perched in creekside willows. Frogs croak along the pond's marshy aprons. Otters chase trout through the submerged branches of downed trees, a forest inverted. The deep water and the close vegetation make the fishing tough, but abundant trout shelter in the meandering side channels and cold depths. And a river runs through it. Norman Maclean captured the trials and ecstasies of angling in beaver country when he wrote of one character. So off he went happily to wade and ooze and to get throttled by brush and to fall through loose piles of sticks called beaver dams and to end up with a wreath of seaweed round his neck and a basket full of fish. And it's not just fishermen and wildlife who benefit. The weight of the pond presses water deep into the ground, recharging aquifers for use by downstream farms and ranches. Sediment and pollutants filter out in the slack waters. Floods dissipate in the ponds. Wildfires hiss out in wet meadows. Wetlands capture and store spring rain and snowmelt, releasing water in delayed pulses that sustain crops through the dry summer. A report released by a consulting firm in 2011 estimated that restoring beavers to a single river basin, Utah's Escalante, would provide tens of millions of dollars in benefits each year. Although you can argue with the wisdom of slapping a dollar value on nature, there's no denying that these are some seriously important critters. To society, though, beavers still appear more menacing than beneficent. In 2013, I lived with my partner, Elise, in a farming town called Paonia, set high in the mesas of Colorado's western slope. Our neighbors' farms and orchards were watered by labyrinthine irrigation ditches, each one paralleled by a trail along which the ditch rider, the worker who maintained the system, drove his ATV during inspections. In the evenings, we strolled the ditches. Our soundtrack, the faint gurgle of water through headgates. Our backdrop, the rosy sunset on Mount Lambourne. One dusk, we spotted a black head drifting down the canal like a piece of floating timber. The beaver let us approach within a few feet before slapping his tail explosively and submarining off into the crepuscule. On subsequent walks, we saw our ditch beaver again and again, perhaps half a dozen times altogether. We came to expect him, and though it was probably our imaginations, he seemed to grow less skittish with each encounter. Like many torrid romances, our relationship acquired a certain tension from the knowledge that it was doomed. Although our beavers showed no inclination to dam the canal, and indeed, beavers often elect not to dam at all, we knew the ditch rider would not tolerate the possibility of sabotage. The next time he passed us on his ATV, a shotgun lay across his knees. The grapevine gave us unhappy tidings a few days later. Our ditch beaver was no more. That zero-tolerance mentality remains more rule than exception. Beavers are still rodenta non grata across much of the United States. They are creative in their mischief. In 2013, residents of Taos, New Mexico lost cell phone and internet service for 20 hours when a beaver gnawed through a fiber optic cable. They have been accused of dropping trees atop cars on Prince Edward Island, sabotaging weddings in Saskatchewan, and ruining golf courses in Alabama, where, gruesomely, they were slaughtered with pitchforks, a massacre one local reporter called the dystopian Caddyshack. It's not funny at all, it's terrible, actually. Sometimes they're framed for crimes they did not commit. Beavers were accused of and exonerated for flooding a film set in Wales. The actual culprits were the only organisms more heedless of property than beavers, teenagers. Often, though, they're guilty as charged. In 2016, a rogue beaver was apprehended by authorities in Charlotte Hall, Maryland, after barging into a department store and rifling through its plastic-wrapped Christmas trees. The vandal was shipped off to a wildlife rehab center, but his comrades tend not to be so lucky. Although our hostility toward beavers is most obviously predicated on their penchant for property damage, I suspect there's also a deeper aversion at work. We humans are fanatical, orderly micromanagers of the natural world. We like our crops planted in parallel furrows, our dams poured with smooth concrete, our rivers straight-jacketed and obedient. Beavers, meanwhile, create apparent chaos, jumbles of downed trees, riotous streamside vegetation, creeks that jump their banks with abandon. What looks to us like disorder, though, is more properly described as complexity, a profusion of life-supporting habitats that benefit nearly everything that crawls, walks, flies, and swims in North America and Europe. A beaver pond is more than a body of water supporting the needs of a group of beavers, wrote James B. Trefethen in 1975, but the epicenter of a whole dynamic ecosystem. Beavers are also at the center of our own story. Practically since humans first dispersed across North America via the Bering Land Bridge, replicating a journey that beavers made repeatedly millions of years prior, the rodents have featured in the religions, cultures, and diets of indigenous peoples from the nations of the Iroquois to the Klingon of the Pacific Northwest. More recently, and destructively, it was the pursuit of beaver pelts that helped lure white people to the New World and westward across it. The fur trade sustained the Pilgrims, dragged Lewis and Clark up the Missouri, and exposed tens of thousands of native people to smallpox. The saga of beavers isn't just the tale of a charismatic mammal. It's the story of modern civilization in all its grandeur and folly. I'm just going to conclude by reading one more. In case that wasn't grandiose enough, I'm just going to read one more slightly more grandiose section. And this is from chapter 2. And apologies to Julia for using a word that she's kind of sick of. At a conference in 2000, the Nobel-winning scientist Paul Crutzen first blurted the word that has come to signify our present homo-dominated epoch, the Anthropocene. The term has become shorthand for humankind's biogeophysical fingerprints, impacts that will someday fascinate and confound alien archaeologists. The radioactive isotopes deposited by nuclear weapons testing, the rapid buildup of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the buried strata of compacted straws in Poland Springs bottles and Happy Meal toys. More than a series of observable phenomena, the Anthropocene is an idea that we have become the planet's principal agents of geological change, the shapers and destroyers of the modern world. Anthropocene isn't a happy word, but it does suggest awe of ourselves. Beavers are not entirely human-like in their environmental effects. They don't burn fossil fuels. They don't hurl waves of plastic upon beaches. They don't turn prairies into cornfields. They're motivated by food and shelter, not acquisitiveness for its own sake. But I'd submit that the difference between our two species is one of magnitude, not of kind. For beavers, too, have permanently shaped the course of biology and geology. They have reformed rivers, kneaded meadows, filled valleys. We built our civilization atop the sediment they left behind. The signature of beavers can today be read scrawled in the seafloor. Their ponds alter our climate, storing carbon in the form of buried organic matter and releasing it as methane. They even serve, as one study put it, as molecular geneticists. By choosing to gnaw down cottonwoods whose bark contains fewer distasteful tannins, they shape the genetic composition of riverside forests. What but the wolf's tooth whittled so fine the fleet limbs of the antelope? The poet Robinson Jeffers asked in Bloody Sire, his meditation on violence and natural selection. No knock against wolves' dagger-like canines, but it's the beaver's orange incisors that have been evolution's most consequential dental sculptors. Add it all up, and their impacts are continental in scale, history-changing in scope. Just as irradiated, elephant-sized cockroaches will someday scuttle through the ruins of downtown Los Angeles, so are we living in the world that beavers created. Christening a new era probably won't win me any friends among geologists, who can't even agree on when the Anthropocene began. But what the heck? Welcome to the Castorocene. That's Castor canadensis is their name. So that's what the book's about, basically the ways in which this incredibly influential rodent has transformed our world, and the ways in which helping that animal return to its former haunts can help us address all kinds of dire ecological problems. So thank you guys so much. I guess we'll just take questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If there are questions, or we can just ask each other questions.
Well, we could start with what we talked about at lunch,
Yeah.
of just the and one of you, I can't remember who, brought it up, kind of what is environmental writing, how do you write positive stories, and blah, blah, blah. And so then we were talking about, okay, what on earth is environmental writing? And so I told this anecdote of when I was a reporter years ago, I made a bet with my editor that I could rewrite the lead of every single story in the paper as an environmental story. And I won the bet for an evening of beer drinking. And I mean, it's hard to kind of separate what is environmental writing from science, from natural history, et cetera, et cetera. We also talked about how, at least maybe in our minds, sometimes environmental writing is about the problems versus nature writing, right? That's about kind of the happier, going into the woods, blah, blah, blah. But even that's an interesting thing that we could talk about as well. What on earth is it? There's another panel tomorrow, and I think it's called something like, it's all environmental writing, which maybe they already answered it. So,
Yeah.
anyway.
I think of environmental writing as, to me, there's an implicit value judgment there, right? I mean, lots of my friends are self-professed science writers, and maybe that's how Paige describes herself. And to me, I mean, certainly I love science writers, and I do lots of science writing. But I also think that when you say that you're an environmental journalist, you're implying there's an action there. You know, that you're making a claim that you care about the natural world and beavers and healthy ecosystems and all of that good stuff. You're not just sort of objectively describing the world. You are implicitly advocating for its protection. So to me, that's what it means to be an environmental writer. Is there's a value judgment embedded in your work.
Ben is right. If anybody had asked, or I guess if they still did ask, I would say, oh, no, I'm a science writer. And then I started thinking about it after we've been on this, put on this panel, and it's like, well, I do advocate that we sort of completely rethink what makes for a good lawn, so that instead of, putting greens, we should have flowers in the lawns for bees. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure that would qualify as environmental writing. And so I think there is, I agree, there is this value piece, and perhaps a more of a, and maybe this goes with the value thing, persuasion, that may be a part of it. Yes?
Can I ask the whole panel, but particularly those who write about bees or beavers or any sort of animal, if you can tell the story from a purely biological standpoint, or evolutionary standpoint, or you can tell it with the addition of cultural and economic kinds of considerations, which are obviously relevant, like particularly in the case of the beaver. So, do you keep those two bits in separate chapters? Do you sort of have one hat on when you're being the biologist and a different hat on when you're making cultural commentary? Or do you weave it all together? Is there any reason to keep it separate? What's the advantage of mixing it? That's my view.
I'm a total weaver myself, because, again, I like telling a story, and so there's bits and pieces that go into telling that story. And I had a lot of readers who are not very into science when I was writing my book. And I found that when I got into the weeds of sort of the biology of the bees too much, they'd be like, oh, we're getting bored. we want you to get back to the story, and a lot of the story has more of what it has to do with them. And so I'm definitely a weaver.
Yeah, me too. And I think that, to me, the story of beavers is fundamentally a cultural and social story. In that, their biology is inextricable from their impacts on human-dominated landscapes. Right? We're sort of, we beavers and humans we're sharing a landscape, and you can't really talk about what they do to the environment without talking about, how they interact with us. And to me, my book is, it's sort of, again, it's ostensibly about beavers, but like there's actually not even a ton of beaver biology in it. I know you never read the Amazon reviews, right? But one Amazon reviewer recently said, well, I didn't even learn the lifespan of a beaver from this book. I'm like, well, you can read that on Wikipedia. That's not what it's about. So to me, it's writing about wildlife and nature is you're fundamentally commenting on human culture and society as well.
The first chapter is about animals, but what I'm trying to also point out is that how very much we kind of come with a stacked deck, or it's not a blank slate. So when I say the word bear, even if you've never had experience with a bear, you have, I had a stuffed bear when I was a child, and I watched, this Grizzly Adams TV series. That's dating me. Or there's a whole lot of things that we bring with it when we're trying to think and talk about animals. So I think weaving is kind of the only way to do it. And that the natural history will not tell us then, well, do we value that? Do we think that's a good animal or a bad animal? And that certainly applies to beaver stuff too. Because that valuation and whatnot is how we treat it as well.
That's a great question. So it's interesting that you guys had talked about adding what is the positives that are in the future. And I'm thinking about one of the books that I read is Lassoing the Sun. And which was an interesting book, but it was just like everything was rosy in the Park Service. Everything's going great. And I just kept thinking, this isn't real. Like there is not a lot of realism there. So how do you keep it real while keeping it positive?
When you were asking that question, I was thinking more about the book I'm working on now, which is climate change. And boy, is that a tough one to think about making it real. Because people kind of, nah, when they hear the word climate change. But if I think about whether it's changes in how we view the nature all around us or whatever, that anytime you mention the word change, that's hard for people to get their heads around. But I think being able to help someone envision a different way of doing things and then the outcomes, which I think, and I remember reading his original High Country News article and going, cool, somebody is recognizing that there's a different way to deal with beavers. But it's hard to get past, I think, a lot of the barriers that people have or minds made up to get them to open and say, oh, okay. This kind of world or this kind of relationship that we might have with all that's beyond human could be a better world. So I don't know how you guys would answer that.
But I don't think I have a problem with making things too rosy. In some respects, I'm more worried about making things seem too hopeless. And again, part of that may be what you choose to write about, because there may be some things that it's like, well, I'm looking for something hopeful here, but I'm not finding it. And I guess part of it is me personally, where it's like, okay, there's that truth, and there are other things. So you sort of pick what you want, and I choose to pick something, again, with the bees. At the moment, they're the bees, that it's like, okay, they're in trouble. And here are some of the ways they're in trouble. And these are some of the things that have happened. And yet, here are some of the things that are being done or can be done so that we don't have to continue down this path for this particular thing. And so, again, I want there to be both sides, if hopefully both sides exist. And so I think coming back to sort of the science piece, for me as part of that, it's like, okay, what's, you need to tell whatever the truth is as well as you can tell it, with both the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, to me, I think that one of the most pernicious attacks on conservation is that it doesn't work, right? You hear that all the time from Congress when they try to dismantle the Endangered Species Act, is that, well, this act is not recovering animals, so let's just get rid of it and let everybody fend for themselves. But I mean, there's the trajectory of wildlife conservation in North America is actually very positive, right? I mean, 100 years ago, you couldn't have seen a beaver in North America. You couldn't have seen a black bear or a wolf or a white-tailed deer or a turkey. So to me, I mean, celebrating our conservation successes it's a critical narrative in that it counters the fatalism and despairism that so often undermines conservation. So to me, I mean, if environmental writing is fundamentally value laden, well, the value that I have is that conservation is important, and to prove it's important, you have to prove that it works. And to me, the story of beavers it's really an incredible triumph and success story, and you can still tell that story while acknowledging all of the the myriad challenges that still confront us.
Ben, on that note, on conservation successes, what do you see as one of the biggest challenges to beaver reintroduction? Is it influencing agencies to do more reintroduction work, or is it landowners?
Are you a beaver guy?
Yeah.
You're not Tory, are you?
No.
No. What's your name?
Lowell Chandler.
Lowell Chandler. Okay, cool. We'll talk later. Yeah, I think that it's. I think that there are so many challenges. I mean, the one that comes to mind because I was talking about it with somebody about it earlier is there's this enormous tension, and this is true of all wildlife management in North America, or in the United States certainly, between between state governments and federal governments, right? Where the federal government, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, or whoever manages the habitat, and the state government, the Fish and Game, manages the animals, right? So over and over again, there's so many places where you see the federal agency, Forest Service typically, reintroducing beavers to improve habitat, and the state agency refuses to close trapping in the same place, right? So you'll get beavers being relocated or reintroduced to an area, and then they're immediately killed. So it's sort of certainly questionable public policy to say the least. So to me, I think that in a lot of ways, the federal government's already on, the Forest Service especially, again, is really on board with beavers, but state agencies are often stuck in this sort of mindset of extracting wildlife to provide opportunities for sportsmen, which I certainly understand and respect, but again can lead to some kind of counterproductive decisions. And that's basically how our agencies are funded, right? Is through trapping, hunting, and fishing licenses. So there's also kind of an economic tension there as well. What's the greatest challenge to bumblebee conservation, or native bee conservation?
Oh, well, it sort of depends on where you are. So in some places it may be pesticide use, but realistically, probably habitat loss and degradation is the biggest issue.
Yeah.
And so with it goes the nutrition piece and where they nest and those kinds of things. So in farm country, it may be the fact of more widespread use of Roundup Ready crops, because then there's less weedy roadsides margins for them, and in garden situations it could be the use of weed and feed and things like that on lawns, so or just more lawns or more pavement, or so habitat loss and degradation.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question back in the back a moment ago. I thought I saw a hand.
Well, yeah, somebody has to ask Ben, so I will. What is the lifespan of a beaver?
300 years. It's in the wild, 12 would be a pretty old beaver. 19 is the oldest I've seen on record, and then captivity they can live to their mid-20s, which is pretty impressive.
And
So-
nobody's asked Paige, but this is a really cool answer of why bumblebees have to pollinate tomatoes, because they do it so differently.
Yeah, so why can't honeybees pollinate tomatoes? Tomatoes and certain other plants need a special kind of pollination called buzz pollination. And what happens with bumblebees and some other kinds of bees is they'll, picture the little yellow, tomato flowers. So the bee will grab a hold of it with part of its mouth parts, and it curls its body around sort of the end of the flower, and then it vibrates its wing muscles at a specific frequency that shakes the pollen out of the tomato's anthers, because rather than like a lily, how the pollen is on the outside of the anthers and you can just rub it off, for tomatoes and certain other plants, they put the pollen inside the anthers and there's these little holes. And so when the bee vibrates its wing at that frequency, it shakes the flower and it shakes the pollen out of those little holes, just like shaking salt out of a salt shaker. Blueberries need the same kind of buzz pollination, and there's a bee in Maine that rather than using its vibrating wing muscles, it drums on the flower with its front legs. So there are other methods, but the honeybee has no method at all. It can't get the pollen out unless it just happens to bump into the flower in the right way and shake a little bit out.
Yep.
Yeah.
I learned that this summer because a friend of mine had a little greenhouse, and her tomatoes weren't working, and she couldn't figure it out, and then she did.
Yep. So before commercial bumblebee production came into being in the mid-1980s, people would hand pollinate, and they had all these methods of hand pollinate, or there would be shake tables where it would shake them, because in the greenhouses,
Right.
there's no wind. Because if you're outside, there's usually enough wind that you get at least a fair amount of pollination just from the pollen getting shaken out that way. But that doesn't work when you're trying to grow tomatoes in greenhouses for those, high-priced tomatoes
Right.
of winter.
Yep.
I have a question for Julia, which is that so this book is about bridging the kind of the traditional cultural gap between humans and nature, and your next book's about climate change communication. What do you see? What is the thread that unites those two?
That's a very good question, and I do see, maybe this is common for many authors, that something arises for you in one book and it kind of, okay, my next book has to be blah, blah, blah. And I think from this one, and this, I also got challenged to write based on my students, but then also me. So I am a professor in hot, polluted Salt Lake City, what can I say? And then I escape every summer to a cabin I built in Wyoming. And it was always so bloody hard to come back to Salt Lake because it just didn't seem like nature. And so I thought, well, shoot, I'm doing it too. I'm discounting it. I'm not seeing it as around me all the time, and I'm also not being as aware as I should be of, my cell phone. It's like a travel log of metals and minerals from all over the world. So it was kind of a question of, what's the big, and this comes up a lot in class discussions, what's the biggest environmental problem? It's that we're consuming the earth. So it's consumption. It's not necessary, and something like climate change, we're not going to solve it by buying hybrids and solar panels, by individual voluntary things. It's going to have to be a big look at the way our relationship with the beyond human. So I have a lot in the next book about kind of our fossil fuel culture, and how individuals are often pointed to as both the promise and the fault for environmental problems. So this is kind of as I see it, the entree into thinking about how we're all implicated and the solution idea. That, okay, I have more impact on nature just by the way I live my life every single day than I do by donating to a wilderness area or something like that. I mean, that's where the pickaxe is kind of in our everyday lives for those wilder places that we love. And I think that's a very, very big conundrum for climate change is we got it really good right now of, cheap consumer products. Even if they break, we can buy new ones and yeah.
Right.
So. And the last chapter in here is called Shut the Door. So it's my battle with a local business owner who he has a kind of a high-end frou-frou market and he leaves his door open. And I tried various things, and so I was looking into, how is it we value or don't value energy? And I noticed going up and down the street here, open doors, in businesses. It's a very common thing. We don't think of the value of energy as very high.
Yeah.
So, and that's an everyday life thing. Yeah. So, thank you for the question.
Yeah. Thanks for the great answer.
Julia, you discussed it in the chapter you read about the European view of wilderness as a scary, awful place. What about the indigenous views?
That's in that chapter.
Okay.
And that, and I've seen this even in more recent research too, that they have no concept of wilderness. And there was somebody who was a public opinion researcher in, I want to say, part of Canada, and he found that when he was interviewing, I think it was Cree people, that the way they described wilderness or the equivalent just didn't make sense to them. And they didn't see, and there's some quotes in that chapter too, it as desolate, etc. It was home. It was all the same, whether there were people there or not. So.
Yes.
Do you think there are biases in the writing communities you occupy towards writing about native species? And what opportunities might there be for writing about non-native species or even invasive species? And is this dynamic shifting at all?
That's a good question.
Well, again, I'm coming at it from the bee point of view, where the non-native species, the honeybee, has gotten most of the press, and so it's like, well, let's look at some of the native species as well. And although the book is called Our Native Bees, that's not the title I gave it. It's the title that the publisher gave it because there's actually a chapter in here on honeybees, and there's actually, I talk about some of the other bees that have made their way in, and it's like, well, here they are. So you can look at it as like, are they bad? Are they good? Are they useful? Are they problematic? So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but there is. At some point somewhere I had said, well, the honeybees have been here since colonial times, and in some respects you can think of it as like they're ours now. And so in a global world, there's the native, non-native piece, and I think trying to exclude some of the non-native bits is not realistic. So how do we make it work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also not a surprising question. So I caught your talk earlier, and I know that's I know that you think a lot about sort of novel ecosystems and the worlds that we've created, and so it's a great question. I think that environmental journalists have a bias toward native species because conservation biologists tend to have a bias toward native species. But of course that's changing, and I think that we're moving with them. I mean, one, just because all I freaking know is beavers. A beaver anecdote I'll share is that so this is not in the book, but I've written about it subsequently. So in 1946, beavers were introduced to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America, and basically because they have no native predators down there, because ecosystems are not really adapted to their very influential presence, beavers just kind of like ran roughshod over the southern tip of South America, and now there are hundreds of thousands of beavers, and they basically have mowed down these forests that are unprepared for them. When you cut a willow in North America, the willow coppices, right? It resprouts all of these shoots, and that's basically an evolutionary response to beaver cutting. But you know, in South America, there is none of that response. When you cut down a tree, it's dead. So you know, beavers are sort of this huge concern down there. And you know, and the Chilean and Argentinian government just announced this plan to kill 100,000 beavers. But there is this recognition among certain sort of countercultural scientists that beavers are certainly transformative in South America, but are they entirely negative? Well, they're also creating lots of snags, dead trees, which are great habitat for native woodpeckers. You know, they're creating these slow water refugia that are being used by endangered native fish. You know, their impacts on forests are probably negative, but their impacts on the ecosystem in its entirety are more complex. And I think that's a growing realization among biologists and us, the writers who follow the biologists, which is that we, as Paige said, we sort of live unavoidably in this world of novel ecosystems that are basically impossible to restore to their former conditions, and and how can we live with them and embrace the biodiversity that exists within them without wringing our hands too much about impacts that we can't control.
Well, bouncing off of that, it's not mine. There's an entomologist from Britain who wrote a book, and so there was a bee that was imported into New Zealand to pollinate the clover that had been imported into New Zealand, and it was a native British bee that has now gone extinct in Great Britain, and so they're looking at trying to bring the bee back from New Zealand to repopulate Great Britain with that particular bee that was once native. So there's some strange things happening as a result of that. And again, sometimes there may be good and sometimes there may not, and more often probably it's mixed.
Yeah. And I knew I talked about introduced species somewhere, and I found it. And I was kind of couching it in terms of humans thinking we control and know how ecosystems operate when we often are just outrageously ignorant. And so it's like, oh yeah, we'll do this, and to take care of that problem, the beetle to take care of the tamarisk, and the even in the 30s in the Dust Bowl, the number of introduced species that were just really stupid ideas, from kudzu, nutria, the monster carp, Russian olive. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it's just thinking that somehow we can know those million different interactions, and it is millions of interactions by doing that. So I think going backwards to native species and getting those, you still face a lot of the same very complex action and reaction chains. So.
I think we're at about
we're out of time.
Yeah, I think we're at about 4:30.
Yep. So, thank you for being